James Lowe, in 1802, more than 55,000 clove plants were imported, but because of, quote, the carelessness with which the newly arrived plants were treated, and subsequently to the prevailing ignorance as to the proper method of cultivating these exotics, and the mistaken belief, he said, that spice trees grew almost without culture, nearly all the plants died away. 3 years later, only 23 bearing clove trees remained in the company gardens, together with 1,625 trees and 1,050 seedlings. Upon being sold, many of these were lost because of mismanagement and, quote, what Lowe says, the continuing ignorance of the proper method of cultivating spices. By 1821, however, cloves were successfully acclimatized at Penang, which became a smaller volume rival to Zanzibar. But compare the initial problems at Penang with the parallel process at Dominica in the British West Indies, and another tiny island, where a single immature plant was obtained by the energetic horticulturalist William Urban Bouet in 1789. As recounted by 19th century English statistician George Richardson Porter, quote, pursuing the directions received with it, that's an important point, he planted it in rich soil and in the shade of other trees. Although this plant withered, Bouet continued to experiment over the next decade with a small number of plants from the French South American colony of Cayenne, quote, in various situations and soils. Surprisingly, he discovered that the clove plant flourished in a poor soil, such that he raised 1,600 trees from seed in raised beds, shaded with plantain leaves, a year later he was able to transplant. And here's Bouet's 1795 treatise, which is, like so many things these days, at least some of it available online. My point here is not that cloves grown on Dominica became a meaningful rival to the extensive clove plantations on Zanzibar, but that the process of transferal and acclimatization of cloves from the Mascarenes to Zanzibar was not a simple matter that we can historically attribute to some unseen Franco-Arab hand. Regrettably, none of the known sources include any evidence of how this process was effected on the ground. On Nguja, where cloves were first planted, all we know is that Sayyid Said was instrumental by first embracing the new cash crop and then by exhorting his Omani subjects to do likewise. The question remains, what did this process involve? Certainly, clearing land must have occurred on a massive scale and probably involved extensive burning of fields to clear the land, since by the 1830s we know that thousands of clove trees flourished at Taif, among other plantations. By itself, felling trees before cultivation did not involve significant plant knowledge, simply available labor. Still, as Christopher Conte has argued in a thoughtful article on the reforesting of former clove plantations on Pemba Island, and here's Pemba Island, and this is, I put it up, and it's sort of one of these impossible maps to read. The brown are clove plantations, cloves on Pemba. If you can find them all, you're a better man than I am. He's argued in this article that African farmers had a long history of applying, quote, their agricultural knowledge to new environments using familiar plants. So we know the Eastern and Southern Africans who made up most of the slave populations across the Western Indian Ocean had already translated, his word, alien plants into farming systems for at least several millennia. Specifically, Conte continues, the slaves who arrived on Pemba in the 19th century would have found a deep and familiar tradition of productive agriculture on the island. At the same time, he suggests that cloves marked a dramatic ecological break from the historical patterns of agricultural production. Indeed, on Nguja and Pemba, he says, slaves probably met cloves for the first time. Certainly true. So when Omani landowners decided to establish plantations to grow cloves as a monoculture, quote, their slaves cleared Pemba's hills, so he's talking about Pemba there, of all vegetation and planted clove saplings, which would yield after about 6 years. Now, although Conte does not date this development on Pemba, He's almost certainly referring to the great expansion of clove plantations after the 1872 cyclone that devastated Nguja's agricultural economy. It pretty much wiped out all clove trees. By this time, of course, knowledge of clove cultivation would have been thoroughly established on both islands. In any event, Conti's informed scenario is equally applicable, I think, in terms of African agricultural knowledge in the early decades of the 19th century. Here I should acknowledge that although Poivre had written instructions on how to cultivate cloves as early as 1772, he didn't publish them himself, but these were published by a French naturalist traveler named Pierre Sonnerat in 1806. And so here's his Voyage aux Indes orientales à la Chine, and it's the third volume published in 1806. And you could see here he says it's the instructions for how to grow nutmeg and cloves, girofle and muscadet. Girofle is clove. And the first part is on nutmeg, and the second part, a few pages later, and it goes on for a couple pages, is about how to grow cloves. So that was published. You have to remember that this was not like, on Amazon or anything like that. It's 1806 we're talking about. So I have no knowledge whether either Saleh or Saleh bin Haramil or Monsieur Sos, the two alleged carriers of cloves to Zanzibar, had read them. We don't know. Indeed, although we lack any evidence, without gainsaying the possibility that either Saleh, Sos, or some other French planter merchant may have introduced such plant knowledge to Nguja, it seems equally possible to me that the first clove plants were accompanied by one or more unknown, very skilled enslaved Africans or Indians who were brought from the Mascarenes to coastal East Africa. It makes sense to me that this is something you might do if you wanted to thrive. Such plant knowledge of this kind that I have previously described for the acclimatization of cloves on both Mauritius and Reunion would have been combined with the Omanian colonial familiarity with the advantages of plantation agriculture for a cash crop, dates and coconuts for Oman, various crops, coffee, sugar across the European colonial world. Although he provides no source, at the end of the 19th century, William Fitzgerald, who was a geographer, worked in British colonial East Africa, wrote that Saleh, quote, accompanied a French officer from Zanzibar to Bourbon and obtained permission to take back a small quantity of seeds and plants with him. So by this time, what had been put together by Burton in 1870 had become sort of general knowledge. He'd probably read it, in fact, in Burton. Unfortunately, we have no contemporary indication of how the plants were nurtured before planting. Did someone establish a proper nursery at Mtoni, the Sultan's first experimental plantation? Who determined the optimum spacing for laying out the plants at Taif and, by extension, on other plantations? And there's a lot of 20th century British colonial literature on how you do this at Zanzibar. Although Frederick Cooper acknowledges the skills acquired over time by enslaved Africans on Zanzibar's clove plantations and carefully describes the details of their demanding labor in planting, harvesting, drying, and transporting cloves to market, his sources did not allow him to answer such questions for this inaugural period of clove plantation. One immediate problem for the successful acclimatization of cloves on Nguja was the fact that average annual rainfall was far below that enjoyed in its native territory of Maluku, so that new plantings had to be watered by hand and carefully weeded. It appears unlikely that such knowledge was acquired on the Mascarenes, where rainfall was parallel. Beyond this initial period of clove plantation, the establishment of clove plantations in Zanzibar, clove cultivation and the establishment of plantations on Zanzibar, there remains the many skilled contributions of enslaved Africans to the mushrooming clove economy on both Nguja and Pemba following the first generation. As Conti recognizes, whatever the agricultural knowledge slaves carried to Pemba depended on which of the multitude of agricultural environments they hailed from and their experience when captured. He also echoes Cooper when he writes that those who survived their passage to slavery, quote, acclimatized and attuned themselves to the rhythm of the clove harvest. Skilled overseers and fellow workers taught newcomers how to perform their tasks properly. In the final analysis, frustrating though it is, unless new evidence is discovered that illuminates the initial phase of clothes acclimatization on Zanzibar, we will never be able to do more than speculate and raise questions about the role played by enslaved Africans with respect to the transfer and adaptation of plant knowledge, whether inculcated on the masquerades or innovated on Zanzibar. So that's the case of Zanzibar. I've never looked in and nobody else has looked in the Reunion archives to see, for example, to find Monsieur Sauce. So I'm going to start corresponding with people to sort of see maybe somebody could do that. So my second case study, which is shorter, looks at how vanilla got from Mexico to the Indian Ocean Islands. Vanilla, which is Vanilla planifolia, is a perennially climbing hermaphroditic orchid indigenous to the humid evergreen forests of Mesoamerica. It has both male pollen-producing staminate and female oval-producing capillate parts of the same plant. These are separated by a membrane, by a membrane, which is in between, that prevents self-pollination. So each plant is a male and female part, but they can't self-pollinate. In its natural state, pollination is achieved by orchid bees. The climbing vine, which could reach lengths of 15 meters or more, grows best in a hot, humid climate up to elevations of 1,500 meters above sea level, with annual rainfall of about 150 to 300 centimeters. So that's about 59 to 118 inches, evenly distributed across the year. It thrives in loose, loamy soils with good drainage. The earliest accounts of this spice date to the middle of the 16th century, following the Spanish conquest of Mexico in 1520. The vanilla orchid grew wild in the forests of what is today the Mexican state of Veracruz, which borders on the Gulf of Mexico. It was collected, not cultivated, by peasant farmers who sold it in local markets. Until the 17th century, vanilla only grew wild, but around that time it began to be domesticated by cutting the vines and planting them closer together in the forest to create ease in harvesting. Since vanilla plants were pollinated by insects, bringing them closer together also increased pollination, and production improved dramatically. In the middle of the 18th century, the region of Papantla, here, north of Veracruz City, became the first center of vanilla cultivation in plantations established by the Teutonic Indians. Under Spanish rule, Papantla controlled the international trade in vanilla, the sole market being Europe, where it was used in cacao-based sweets. In particular, demand was driven from Spain and France, where it became a royal monopoly in 1692. In the mid-18th century, vanilla cuttings began to be introduced from the West Indies to England, where gentleman horticulturalist Charles Francis Greville, and for those East Africanists here, this is an ancestor of Greville Freeman Grenville. So, where Charles Francis Greville cultivated it in his Paddington greenhouse in the early 1800s. So these are, this is what people did in those days. This plant became the lectotype, which is the plant chosen in lieu of the wild plant that they had. It became the lectotype of vanilla planifolia that was propagated shortly thereafter throughout all the botanical institutions in continental Europe, and subsequently gave rise to all the closely related genetic variations that came to thrive in the Indian Ocean environments. They all derive from this one lectotype. Here we are focused on the introduction of vanilla to Réunion. As Réunionnais social scientist Raoul Lucas observes, the introduction of vanilla is in keeping with a long-time tradition of acclimatization carried by scientists, administrators, naval officers, or laymen. They were keen on enriching the vegetal heritage, thereby contributing to the economic development of Réunion. No less important was the reality that the planters of Bourbon long dreamed of being the first to break the Spanish monopoly on vanilla. After all, he remarks, Mexico had a 200-year-old monopoly over vanilla exports, which made beans extremely expensive, as in fact they still are today. We can see that the same kind of European imperial scientific curiosity and commercial interests that operated in wresting the Indonesian spice monopoly from Dutch hands was clearly at play in the introduction of vanilla to Réunion. Beginning in 1819, there were 3 different varieties of vanilla introduced to the French island colony from different parts of the globe. The one that proved most successful and has since become the dominant strain across the entire Indian Ocean world was introduced by a colonial administrator on the 25th of September, 1822, which we know because we know the ship that it was brought on. It was based on cuttings from Mexican vanilla, Vanilla planifolia, that he had obtained from the Paris Museum of Natural History, where they had been greenhouse grown. Once landed, rather than send the cuttings to the Royal Botanical Garden, and here it is in Saint-Denis with the great block in the middle. I stayed at a little hotel around the corner from that first time I went to Réunion. Rather than doing that, they were distributed to a number of colonists who were known to be careful agriculturalists as a strategy, quote, to ensure the acclimatization of this precious plant and their acclimatization to new environments. As vanilla crops can be easily established from stem cuttings, it is not surprising that they soon proliferated on Réunion. These plants did not, however, produce the pods from which vanilla beans were extracted. The problem was that vanilla requires sexual pollination and that the floral structure of vanilla makes natural self-pollination difficult. Accordingly, vanilla required what scientists call an outcrossing reproductive mode. In Mesoamerica, the native habitat of Vanilla planifolia, the main pollinators, as I've said, were a specific species of orchid bees that did not exist on Réunion. So while vanilla plants took root on Réunion, they did not benefit yet the economy of the French economy. In the 1830s, first a French and then a Belgian botanist in Europe independently discovered methods for artificially pollinating vanilla, but neither technique proved to be economically viable. Useless. The breakthrough occurred in 1841 when a young enslaved African, who we don't know where from, invented a simple method for hand pollinating by using a thin stick or blade of grass combined with a flick of his thumb to smear the sticky pollen from the flower's anther over the stigma. And here's how it's done. Here's a 19th century, so you can see it's from the Études sur la vanille, showing how it's being done with this holding the flower. And then here's a series of photographs of modern, they're actually from Madagascar, showing how this is done. And I'll come back to this. This person, whom Raoul Lucas calls, quote, a slave of genius, was named Edmond, who received the surname of Albius on his emancipation in 1848. At the time of his discovery, he was 12 years of age and worked in the garden of his master, Ferréol Bellier-Beaumont in Sainte-Suzanne. Here's where it's at. So the capital of, and La Réunion is still a French département. It's not, so here's where Saint-Denis is the capital, and Sainte-Suzanne is basically just around the corner. This whole center of the island is volcanic and high, so it's around the side. Edmond was an orphan, his mother Mélisse having died in childbirth, while his father Pamphile remained unknown to him. Although Edmond had no formal education, he acquired horticultural skills, including the botanical names for plants, by accompanying his master. According to author Tim Eckhart, looking back on Edmond's feat, Bellier-Beaumont wrote, "This young black boy became my constant companion, a favorite child always at my feet." Lucas goes on to quote Edmond's master as recounting, quote, "Walking around with Edmond, I noticed on the only vanilla plant that I had a glossy black pod. I showed my surprise, and he told me that he had actually pollinated the flower. I refused to believe him and moved on. But 2 or 3 days later, I saw a second pod close to the first one. He repeated his assertion. I asked him how he did it. He performed his manipulation, and it's the right word, his manipulation in front of me. And I had to acknowledge it when I saw the operation repeated each day and every time with the same success." Bellier-Beaumont's close colleague, Eugène Volsi-Faucard, confirms, quote, "Edmond had seen his master practice some bringing together among certain flowers. His faithful and wise observation led him to try the same operation on vanilla. More specifically, Bellier-Beaumont indicates that Edmonds' technique for pollinating vanilla was an adaptation of the manual fertilization that the Frenchman had used for watermelon. Like many of us here, I did not know that watermelon has to be pollinated by hand. I knew that dates had to be, because you can see in Egyptian hieroglyphs, you can see them pollinating dates, and they're still pollinated by hand. But watermelon also has to be pollinated by hand. As he wrote, quote, "This clever boy had realized that the vanilla flower also has male and female elements and worked out for himself how to join them together." Either way, the result was the same, and Edmonds' discovery was rapidly disseminated among the French colonial planters on the island. Defending Edmond against those who would deny him recognition for his remarkable innovation, remember, this is before the end of slavery, Bellier-Beaumont stated emphatically, quote, "It is entirely due to him that this country owes a new branch in industry, for it is he who first discovered how to manually fertilize the vanilla plant." As Brixius observes, quote, "With his method, Edmond revolutionized the cultivation of vanilla and helped Bourbon to achieve a breakthrough into the vanilla trade." Like tea picking, this delicate job for those was a delicate job for those with small hands, such as Edmond. It will come as no surprise that not everyone accepted that a slave boy like Edmond Alpers had made this revolutionary discovery, a method of hand pollination that still prevails in today's cultivation of vanilla. And let me show, and here's Edmond Alpers. This photograph on the left, I found, I'd like to have greater verification that it's actually Alpers, but the one on the right, there's a famous album de la Réunion that this Roussan did, was published already in 3 or 4 volumes. It's got unbelievable, all the stuff I've done on like African dances and masquerades, not all of it, a lot of it comes from photographs that he had. So here's this iconic photograph of Edmond Alpers, obviously as an older man. Edmond certainly had his advocates, most vocally Bellier-Beaumont and Volcy-Faucard, but he drifted away from rural Saint-Suzanne to the capital of Saint-Denis, only returning to die in poverty on August 9, 1880. What is evidence in the case of vanilla on Reunion, as it was in the parallel example of cloves on Mauritius, is the central role played by slave labor in the acclimatization of exotic plants. In both cases, while these potential cash crops were introduced by French colonists to the islands, specifically with economic benefits in mind, it was the agency of enslaved gardeners, both African and Indian, that made successful domestication possible. Now, the next step in making vanilla a viable cash crop was to determine the best method for curing the raw beans. In the 1850s, 2 French planters developed a boiling water process that was soon widely adopted. So here's how vanilla grows on, in this case, on a local tree in Reunion. And here shows the green vanilla bean. And after the boiling process, which is done at about, I think, 130 to 150 degrees, it's only done for like 90 seconds or so. And then you put them out to dry. So the vanilla bean is then dried like clove flowers. By the end of the century, Réunionnais vanilla rivaled sugar in profitability for French planters, while it also became the avatar of Creole culture on the island. Once vanilla became a meaningful cash crop on Réunion, entrepreneurial French planters introduced the same strain of vanilla to other Indian Ocean islands. It's ironic that the first introduction was to the British Seychelles. The Seychelles had been part of the French masquerades, and after the Napoleonic Wars, they also became British. So the first introduction was in 1866, where it flourished to such an extent that it dominated the local economy within a decade. That's pushing, even the coconuts were still growing, pushing coconuts now. So here's the boiling so from Madagascar in this case, in a small scale. So here are the Seychelles, and there's Mahe, which is the main island of the capital. Production was in the hands of smallholders who mostly sharecropped. Some even became quite wealthy. Exports began modestly in 1877, and by the end of the century, total production amounted to almost half that of Réunion. far surpassing the value of coconuts. According to one historian, it had become the outstanding product. Fanny Barclay, who resided on Mahi Island between 1882 and 1888 when her husband was commissioner for the Seychelles, includes a short chapter in her memoir of this period on the preparation of vanilla. Of particular interest is her observation about pollination, which she correctly understood to be achieved in Mexico by insects. Quote, "In the Seychelles, they must be fructified, or to use an expression commonly in vogue there, married by human aid. Each individual flower has to undergo this process, but as it requires great delicacy of touch to handle these wax-like flowers, women and children are employed for that purpose in preference to men." So here we see an unknown tribute to the ingenuity of Edmund Albius. In the last quarter of the 19th century, French planters experimented with vanilla in the Comoros and Madagascar, but it was only at the end of the century that it finally took off as a major cash crop in Madagascar. And this is the area, and this is actually quite a nice map because it shows going to the Comoros, to Mayotte, to Nushi Bay, which is now a part of Madagascar. And then it's mainly grown in the northeast of the thing coming from Reunion Island. And interesting, you can see down here, the 1841 doesn't have Edmund Albius's name here yet, but it's got it. From a French colonial plantation crop, vanilla is now produced by Malagasy farmers. Fieldwork research in the 21st century reveals that vanilla farming in some regions of the island has given rise to the social reality that, quote, "being a skilled vanilla farmer is a point of pride." So complete is this identification that the plant is now regarded as indigenous. According to anthropologist Sarah Osterhout, quote, "Maybe before vanilla was from somewhere else," one farmer told me, "but now vanilla is Malagasy." So let me end my talk by giving you a couple of conclusions and comparisons. And then here's in Madagascar, and you can see this young, looks like a sort of maybe pre-adolescent, hard to tell how old she is, but fructifying, I love that. It's a very Victorian description, marrying the two. Although the sagas of cloves and vanilla in the 19th century Indian Ocean world are not quite the same, they do highlight several important themes that bear reiteration and further examination. First, both reflect a fusion of imperial rivalry, capitalist expansion, and scientific innovation that played themselves out on the Mascarene Islands with parallel economic results that took very different forms. In the case of cloves, the sustained French initiative to break the Dutch stranglehold on clove production ended up being fully exploited only by Omani Arab colonial state of Zanzibar, itself ironically a client of British Indian capital and imperialism. In that of vanilla, French attempts to expand plantation production to the other islands of the Southwest Indian Ocean largely proved futile, excepting the Seychelles, which they no longer control, until the end of the 19th century, which of course is when they conquered Madagascar in 1895. Second, the scale of production differs significantly between the two commodities. Clove trees require space and came to dominate large tracts of land that evolved into a monoculture closed canopy forest. Vanilla vines, by contrast, occupy much less territory and were incorporated into agroforestry gardens. Third, whereas the labor requirements of cloves could be met by the expansion of plantation slavery on Zanzibar, and of course gave rise to its enormous expansion, where British abolitionism had not yet been realized, the timing of vanilla expansion coincided with the French abolition of slavery in 1848, so that production depended either on smallholder peasant production or on the thinly disguised system of engaged labor, which is a form of disguised slavery. Furthermore, while most of what we know about the production process of cloves is centered on men, though women certainly had a role, and you can see there pictures of women sorting dry cloves and things like that. The pollination of vanilla clearly demonstrates the important role of female and child labor in making this cash crop successful. Finally, we have seen the critical role that was played by enslaved individuals whose intelligence, industry, and innovation were fundamental in acclimatizing both plants. How many more examples like Hilaire, Charles Rama, and Edmond Albius might there be in the long history of slavery in the Indian Ocean world? I end with this. I found this is a slide I hadn't seen before, which gives you both two different sort of hands doing pollinating the thing, and now giving Albius with the same picture in something called the Science Agriculture, which is an online science journal. Anyway, that's it. Thank you. It took you a long way from just Africa, from Mexico to Eastern Indonesia. One of the real pleasures of doing Indian Ocean world history is that it's very much world history. So if anybody has any questions, having
plenty of time for Q&A section.
Yeah, I thought that was a wonderful talk, and I had read that it was an Omani Arab who brought cloves to Zanzibar, and that basically was the narrative. And then wandered around from one clove plantation to another with Abdul Sharif, which was really interesting. What I came to a very different view of, and I think, this is not to disagree with your analysis at all. I came to a somewhat different view of the process a few years ago, when maybe 7 or 8 years ago, when I was at the research station at Amani in Tanzania, up in the mountains.
in Sisal country,
Yeah. And Amani was in German times a forestry research station, and then in British times a disease research station for vector-borne diseases that are carried from animals or snails or whatever to people by one vector or another. What I decided at Amani, there was a big project going on the production of knowledge in this kind of setting. And I was asked if I could contribute to it in some way. And what I decided was that I would focus on the African research assistants for exactly the reasons that you're talking about. And what I discovered was that Amani is a place where rainfall is very high, where temperatures are high enough to grow the spice trees, and the rainfall is high enough to grow the spice trees. And the soil, I hadn't heard the part about horse soil. The soils are very rich because they were cleared forest. And what I discovered was that the research assistants, and only the research assistants, were becoming very rich. They really were becoming wealthy men by growing cloves, by growing cinnamon, by growing nutmeg.
in Amani, around.
In Amani, right, up in the mountains, because it was the right temperature, it was very good soil, it was very high rainfall. And those are conditions that don't exist many places, which tells you why cloves are expensive, because you can't find that right combination of conditions. And what I discovered was that the only people who succeeded in doing this were the research assistants at the Amani research station, who were living near the research station in villages with their families. And the reason was that they were the only people there who had enough regular, predictable cash income to wait for the number of years for the spice trees to produce. So it's one more element in this. So there's the acclimatization, the botanical acclimatization, and there were acclimatization gardens all over the Indian Ocean and beyond. There was one famous one at Cape Town, for example, for similar purposes. But altogether, aside from the botanical acclimatization, on which I'm convinced by your narrative, and I think it's great, there is a question of, if you are dealing with people who are farming for their own sustenance, then there needs to be some mechanism of credit, and credit exists in that process of enslavement and production using slave labor. There needs to be some mechanism of credit or some mechanism within which the workers on it can sustain themselves for the number of years that it takes the spice trees to grow. So it's more about the labor process
Right.
and the
No,
nature
no.
of production and the household economy process.
So that makes absolute sense to me because clearly the capitalization and the credit that was available was there in
Right,
Omani hands.
right,
And since it takes 6 to 8 years,
yeah,
obviously the labor
yeah,
that was brought in, had to be supported in some ways, but in the slave system, they didn't have, in a sense, they were part of the larger capitalizing process.
right, and people from India were supplying much of the capital, and there was this whole dynamic of debt and, the whole debt economy of Unguja. So in a way, the debt economy of Unguja took care of that period
Right.
when people had to sustain themselves until the spice trees could produce.
That's very interesting. Yalmon is is it technically in Usambara?
It's the East Usambaras,
That's right.
and because it's closer to the Indian Ocean,
It's gonna get rain.
it has more
Gets a
rainfall.
rain shadow, yeah.
And for the same reason, it has that high level of rainfall at relatively high temperatures, at lower altitudes than you would need for the higher rainfall in the West Usambaras. And I mean, it's very peculiar because what the British were doing was studying, making intensive studies of malaria. And they liked living high up in the mountains in the forest where everything was beautiful, but there wasn't much malaria, but that's where they established their malaria research station.
I think this actually flows from what you were saying. I don't know if you compared these trees to other trees, but in Jonathan Robbins' book about the oil palm, he makes an argument, which of course, is coming from West Africa and then spreads to other parts of the world, that they are tended more than they are actually cultivated. And in looking at the I don't remember which French botanist or whoever scientist was giving directions, when he was talking about the clove trees, he really was saying that they have to be tended, and he was giving a lot of descriptions of, the conditions, but one of them, of course, was also that they need shade, and so there had to be other trees where they have to be planted, that have to be planted with them, because they can't, when I was just, looking specifically. So I was just thinking that, just to echo the point of the needing, sort of credit supporting or debt, supporting a system of long-term living with the plants, the trees. It's almost like there's a long-term, they're tended, cared for more than they are actually sort of just planted, right? We sort of think of a plantation as, this kind of rapid turnover, but instead there's actually like a caring process. So it's quite different from the labor that you were talking about, right? We were talking about, because that's the next stage. This is the primary stage. So it's just to say that I think there's a lot of that you can sort of build up in that story about who's caring for these plants and looking at the way that the ladders were built, the men built the ladders.
And there are actually some, if you go online, there are actually some modern pictures of people with ladders from, last year or something like that, doing that sort of a thing. It's one of the things this is if you like, the spoken version of a longer paper, which it has actually an interesting genesis, because this is not normally what I've been doing, although I've done 2 papers on cholera now too. So, but Mike Feener, who's now in Osaka, but was in Singapore for many years and at Oxford, asked me to they were doing something the Ministry of Culture in Indonesia was doing during the pandemic, was doing a webinar on the spice trade. We know each other. He asked me if I'd do something, so I just started reading. Vanilla had never once crossed my mind, but that put me on the George Brixius's work, which is really terrific. Well, in the longer paper, one of the things I also have, which was fast, I really went down a rabbit hole on this, is there's a mention about the implements that they were using to cultivate. It was very vague, so I started following it. Burton has something. Burton typically has something about everything almost, and I ended up with this long correspondence with Martin Walsh and Derek Nurse and a whole bunch of people on definitions of what kinds of implements you use. And so Martin typically has, incredibly exotic dictionaries he's found and things like that. And I've got a paragraph, which I didn't include here because it's really, as I said, it's pretty obscure, on implements which might have been introduced from Oman. It might have been Arab, but they might also have been African innovations on hoes, because they weren't djembes. They weren't using a djembe. They're using basically, the kind of wedge-shaped thing that you would use if you were planting something in the ground.
By the way, sackflower can be enormously valuable on this. There's a dictionary put together by Sackler in the early 20th century.
Oh, I have a copy.
In which he tells you where things come
I know,
from
and he tells you which dialect they're in. I've
Yeah.
had a copy of that. It's one of the weirdest things for anybody else who's interested in Swahili. Sackler was a Spiritan missionary in Zanzibar and the Comoros, and he accumulated this incredible dictionary, which is published by the Institut d'Ethnologie in Paris in 1936, and they must have done a run of 10,000 because you can still buy it for
Was it
like
1913?
it's not very expensive. I mean, and it's an incredible book. So that if you're doing stuff, it's more useful than any of the other period dictionaries. Anyways, Yeah. Hi.
So I'm wondering, because you mentioned that this like vanilla production is serving as an example of European imperialism as motivation for scientific pursuit, for discovery. And I just wanted to hear a little more on like how this becomes this primary example above all else. Is it because of the successful globalization? Or is it for other reasons?
It's interesting to do this kind of work. It's like the work on, Steve knows a lot about it. Work on cholera or something, or the thing I've done on chikungunya. I suddenly find myself reading a lot of scientific stuff for which I'm not trained, and which I then have to kind of retrain myself how to read. So there's a mass of ethnobotanical, but also just straight up scientific botanical stuff on this, and apparently, so you got this one native version of vanilla in Veracruz, and once it becomes commercialized in the 17th century, and people start moving in, and it's going to typical, it is France and Spain, but everybody else is messing around trying to learn. I mean, this is what European. I mean, it's very much part of the expansion of capitalism and geography and all these related disciplines. So this one, and I presume the books that I've read about vanilla, a wild version gets to England, and Greville manages to read it sufficiently that it's really good. And then I guess colleagues from France, and I think Hamburg and maybe Berlin and Belgium, it moves. So it's in every one of these botanical gardens. So that when the French naval captain takes this version, I think one of the other, there were actually 5 versions of vanilla that were brought to reunion, 2 of them after this one came. So one came from Tahiti, one came from Cayenne, but this was the one that they took, and it was so successful that it was the one they just kept on taking out. So that genetically, I mean, I've read 2 or 3 articles, very scientific. Genetically, there's hardly any genetic difference at all in every kind of vanilla grown everywhere in the Indian Ocean world, whether it's in Indonesia or Madagascar or Reunion or where. But I think that process, that's a process of, and you can see that, like what Professor Feynman was saying, is that gentlemen, and they were all very, almost exclusively androcentric, gentlemen, scientists, horticulturalists, had the money to do this. You didn't have to go out, maybe you had a seat in Parliament or something like that, or in the House, but you didn't have to do anything. So the same notion of having the credit, and that's why I decided when I was, trying to edit down and think how long, I thought, no, let me keep the 2 examples of Penang and Dominica. And the Dominican one's fascinating because this is one example, and this one guy who spends 10 years figuring out how to make it work there. And which makes the point that you just can't take a plant from one place to another. As anybody who is an amateur gardener knows, you bring something home from the garden supply place, you dig a hole, you try to do, and you get lazy, you don't put as much mulch, you forget to put fertilizer in, and you sit around and you give it enough water, hopefully not too much, not too little, and a month later it's dead. And you only have to do that a few times in your life to realize that it's sort of like you do have to read the instructions. And so this is a long process. And in a way, it's interesting. It's a modern version. I mean, if you're thinking about early African history, for example, or early Indian Ocean history, where food plants are moving from Asia across to Africa, and from Africa to Asia. Banana is the best example. I mean, you think about a banana, which we all get. This one says dole.
Right.
But in point of fact, you go to East Africa, and the ones I love for their size, and their name is Mkono Watembo, which is this huge plantain, which is named elephant's trunk. But the best ones are these little tiny things you would get down in Bunia Cusa. They taste like lemon or pineapple. I mean, they're different. They're just fantastic, different. So there are more varieties of banana in East Africa, I think, than anywhere in the world. Even though the 2 original, they're not lectinotypes, but the 2 original types are, one's a South Asian version and one's a Southeast Asian version. So the whole business of plant genetics is just fascinating. When you think about, like, how do people decide that wheat, that some version of wheat could actually be turned into flour to be turned into bread? I mean, it's a long process. And so these are interesting examples of a much more rapid process, but it's the same notion. Somebody has to figure out how to do it.
Question from it's interesting perspective from the botanical side of things, from the commercial side of things, were these gentlemen trying to gain some sort of commercial advantage, or were they looking for credit or membership in a historical society? How is the demand created for these spices? Right? You mentioned, I think, for vanilla that the French king had the exclusive rights to it, and the price was very high. But then, in order to make it a prosperous crop, you need to create demand from the public. So how does that work? What's
Cadbury. What's that? Cadbury. No, I mean, as I said, the way vanilla was used in Europe was with cacao to make chocolate.
Right.
And it's like, as average, or these working people's incomes went up, people wanted more of things that had only been at some point, held exclusively. And there's always somebody who's gonna then take advantage of it and make more of it. So,
The cloves wind up in fruitcakes,
so
and that was the
cloves
popularity.
are interesting. There's actually, it's now been discrete, but there was what people said was a fossilized clove was found in somewhere in southern Syria, like from 3,500 years ago. And suddenly then everybody says, aha, it got, it went from here to there. Turns out it's a different variety. It's like cinnamon. It turns out there are many varieties of cinnamon, which is the bark of a tree. And so you have to know which one you're talking about. Right. And the other thing that's tricky, once you move further back, and especially using written, I mean, this is the great advantage of archaeobotany and things, that once people start using genetic tracers, you might not know how, but you can tell which one something is by its genetic makeup. Whereas when you read the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is the first century Greek Egyptian document about Indian Ocean trade, and it'll describe something. You have to, which you can't necessarily just take it the way it's described. Like, this was traded like clothes, or they used rafts, and then you have to see, well, what do they mean? What is this? So, but we know that clove flowers were being used in China. Of course, the Chinese had a great civilization. So cloves were known for a long time, but the thing was that they were being only grown in this one place, and that's why, when the Portuguese and then the Dutch came in, they were really keen to get a hold of this, and the Dutch, kind of transformed it.
There was already a built-in market. Right?
There was already a
You
built-in
grow
market.
cloves,
I actually,
you make wine.
I have a quote in the longer paper. There's a quote from, it's a quote from Dante from the Inferno that mentions cloves specifically and talks about how important, how rich they were and everything like that. So they were, they had made it to a certain level of European, and of course the connections from up the Red Sea or overland to the Middle East was very much part of the Mediterranean. So it's not surprising. But it's certainly something. And again, if the kind of food histories, medieval, you think about these Renaissance fairs and places like this, or your dancing maidens, and your local, whatever. But they have medieval food was pretty awful. It was either mush or cooked to death because people didn't have much in the way of teeth, and it didn't taste like much. So spices became very important. Pepper, of course, too. And so stuff was spiced up. So if you've ever tried or been with, had friends who said, let's have a medieval meal, and you make a medieval meal, they're really pretty terrible. Because the spicing was weird. I mean, weird to our taste in a way that kind of, if you like, global tastes don't work today. But spices became really important in the Indian Ocean world, clearly. Yeah. Lee.
Was Alpers literate at all?
What?
Was he literate?
Not that we
only know
he
about.
wasn't literate when he discovered this. I presume, I mean, nobody's done a full biography. We know certain things about him.
Mhm.
But once he gets liberated and acquires a surname, he seems to have, gone to the big city of Saint Denis, which is not a very big city, but he kind of disappears because he's not really very important anymore. He's done his job. And so I don't know if I think my sense is that he must have become at least semi-literate because he sort of adopts European ways and he lives until 1881. But we don't know very much of that. He certainly didn't write anything.
I mean, nothing about his descendants. I mean, there's no network, family network of this.
Right, yeah,
You know, this kind of thing you suspect.
No, and as far as I know, he didn't leave any, children or anything like that, so. And I think there's a lot, somebody should dig further. And as I was, again, thinking about the reunion, Brixius has done all this work, and Eugenia Rodriguez has done a lot of work on Mauritius and some in Reunion, but nobody's gone looking specifically for this in this, let's say the last decade of the 18th, and the first 2 decades of the 19th century, see if we can't find out more about who some of these people were. And of course, people don't necessarily write about these things. So, and there's no tradition of it.
There's kind of a category, you know, these groups of, you know, sort of specialists, niche people who know stuff. Maybe they kind of go on and they live on. It's like someone did the archaeological economy
Right,
of Egypt. You know, the foremen and the workers and the kind of assistants. They often pass this kind of knowledge on to their, you know, family members, and then they serve the next generation of that.
Right. Oh, yeah,
Over
absolutely.
time.
I mean, it's artisanal in that sense.
Yeah, yes, exactly, right.
And that's why this, you know, somewhere I'd read about in some of the stuff I'd read about Reunion in the past, I knew about Edmond, but I didn't know all this stuff about cloves in Mauritius. And that's where Brixius, who's a historian of science, really opened my eyes. I mean, her work is really meticulous and fascinating. And the other thing, I mean, there is some of this in the kind of standard works on Peter Pavla, but he'd been in Southeast Asia, in Siam and places like that for like 8 or 9 years in various French capacities, making connections and looking up. You know, so he was not just somebody who sailed, because that's the impression you get when you read popular things, and the way he. But even some of the academic, you know, he came and he brought the cloves, and then cloves went to Zanzibar, and so it's been fun, sort of trying to fit. And you said, you very kindly prefaced your comments, Steve, by saying, "I'm not. This is not to argue with you, but this is not definitive by any means. I mean, this is, you know, I write something like this in the hopes that somebody will come along and say, by the way, Eugenia, there was just this conference in Zanzibar, which this paper was originally written for. And I said, they said, "You're coming to Zanzibar?" And I turned to my wife, and Annie said, "You're not going to Zanzibar now." So I didn't go to Zanzibar, but I didn't particularly want to go to Zanzibar right now. And a lot of people didn't. It was a fairly small conference, but she gave the paper for me. And she said, Abdul did not agree. He did not think that that's, he didn't, so I don't know if Abdul just wasn't thinking about it or something, but
Abdul did not agree with this paper.
did not agree with the version that Eugenia gave of this paper there, which is sort of this version with, in 20 minutes, read by a Portuguese speaker, you know, so. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a very simple question.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to ask you about the uses of gloves, because like with all this history and so on. For example, for me, I only use it for tea, and in the past, like what's it used for, and whether they use, like, why this longing for gloves, like was it associated with another kind of consumption in which, like, gloves is important, and
Yeah, well, that actually kind of goes back to the question is how now that you know how to produce clothes. Vanilla's not so difficult. Vanilla, you know, this was being sort of worked out in the courts and the wealthy families in Europe, and you know, people were having bonbons with chocolate and things like that. That became, clothes are a little trickier. So the Chinese use in I mean, all of these things get used in medicines and also in religion, you know, in infusion, you know, smoke. So there are people who are using them. In some cases, they use it to fumigate and spirit possessions and all kinds of possibilities. So the interesting thing, the second or third stage of this is then now that people have something like this and they say, you know what, really, it smells good and it's tough on the tongue. How do you use it? I'll tell you, there's a nutmeg story since Fritzi's work was actually focused on nutmeg. One of our son's friends, this is about 25 or 30 years ago, he said, I heard that nutmeg was hallucinogenic. He said, so now we don't think of nutmeg. Nutmeg and mace come from the same tree. But he said, so I thought I'd just, grate a little and and he ended up grating like 1.5 nutmegs. And Max, I refuse to go, he was high for about 2.5 days because nutmeg is a serious hallucinogenic. And, nobody, people, smoking dope or whatever. But I remember, and all of his friends had sort of come around and gathered and doing things, because it was a high they didn't recognize. So people must have done things like that. I mean, how do you learn to leach cassava so that you don't die? Because it's poisonous. So clearly some people died. There's no question about it. We just don't know who they were because they're dead. And it happened a long time ago. But people experimented with all of these things and how they used it. So cloves, now of course, cloves have got all these uses. At the time in Europe, I think it was used for things like condiments and cakes and things like that. It was going, and it's different from, let's say, something like dates, which Matt has. So dates, once you've got a dried date, well, you could cook with it, but you can just eat it. As it's sort of you can't break fast without dates if you're a Bedu. And so there's some things where you don't need to do anything more of it. You can just eat it. As would be the case with most fruits. And then people say, oh, I wonder what it would be like cooked in a pie or something like that or something. But spices are trickier, and by and large, all of them. And there's some spices which are not used, Indian spice. I think things like asafoetida. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff which they say put if you have it. Which of course now you can get everything. Yeah. So you put it in, and I'm never quite sure what it's doing. But if I'm making Indian food, I put it in. So, but somebody has figured out things like that. So there's using pickling spices, I mean, you name it. But I think in terms of Zanzibar, cloves, as far as I know, where people are probably using cloves in tea and maybe in coffee.
How old is biryani?
Now they're using
Perfume.
perfume, yeah.
Add to perfume.
I think if you soak it in
Extract it.
oil, exactly.
Well, the oil,
Because also
clove oil,
clove
yeah,
has
that's
oil.
right. Yeah,
It's
that's,
very hot.
yeah, it's very hot.
Yeah.
Oh, very hot. Clove oil is very hot. But it's like ylang ylang. It's another. There's a MA student at UCLA I've been working with. Zoom is wonderful that way. And he's been in the Comoros, and he's in Paris right now. He's giving a paper at Thomas Vernet's, Samuel Sanchez's seminar, because he's been doing his MA thesis on ylang in the Comoros, because there's this huge industry. I mean, he says it's really interesting how it's produced, but he says there's this enormous French perfume industry behind it.
I actually think, because I have done research on the animal, the civet, that
Oh, right.
the Europeans, and the Arabs wanted to take the musk to make perfume from the 14th, 13th century. So a lot of the perfumes and soaps were actually scented by the spices. And soaps,
Yeah.
soaps and perfumes were scented by the spices that,
Right.
like ylang ylang is extremely important.
Yeah.
for
So
perfume.
there's and of course there's a long non-Western history of perfumes, which is really important. And so all these things, I mean, there's commodity history has become very interesting in that respect. But of course now, our clothes got used, which we sent to Indonesia and made into cigarettes, used so you get clove cigarettes, which were the big sellers in Tanzania in the 60s, I remember, 60s, 70s, they were big. But you were right about clove oil, though. Any kind, in fact, I had one of the slides I didn't use. I was looking for something that showed the water process, and the thing I found first of all was how you make vanilla extract, which you use in baking. And now I thought, no, that's not what we want because that's a different process. It goes through a distillation process. So then I found these other slides that show the boiling process. So,
Well, on that note.
yeah,
Thank you. This was wonderful.
thank you. Thank you for inviting me.